It was not a coup. It was not a power struggle. It was not about replacing one leader with another. This was an assassination attempt. On the night of January 3rd, just hours after families across Burkina Faso finished celebrating the new year, a plan was already in motion to end one man's life. While most people were sleeping while fireworks had barely faded from the sky, a bullet was being prepared for Ibrahim Traoré. Not tomorrow, not someday. That very night. And what makes this moment even more chilling is this was not the first time. According to those closest to the investigation, this was at least the third attempt on his life in less than 2 years. 3 times someone decided that reform was too dangerous. 3 times someone concluded that change must be stopped with violence. History has seen this pattern before. When leaders challenge broken systems, when they interfere with long-standing networks of privilege, they rarely fall quietly. They are pushed, then hunted, and often silenced. Africa knows this story all too well. What shocked many observers was not just the plot itself, but its nature. This was not about storming a palace or announcing a new government on the radio. The goal was brutally simple. Get close enough, pull the trigger, and let chaos do the rest. Once the man was gone, the country would follow. That raises uncomfortable questions, especially for those watching from the outside. Who truly benefits when a young leader trying to rebuild his country is eliminated? Why do threats so often come from within, not from afar? And why do stories like this barely make headlines while their consequences reshape entire regions? Tonight, we're not here for rumors or speculation. We're here to understand what really happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about power reform and survival in today's Africa. Please stay with us. Share this story if you believe some truths are too important to ignore. And subscribe if you think the world should pay closer attention before the next silence becomes permanent. The operation did not begin with gunfire. It began quietly, methodically, behind closed doors, far from public view. According to the official security briefing, the plot reached its execution phase at approximately 11:00 p.m. on January 3, 2026, just hours after the New Year celebrations had ended in Burkina Faso. While streets were emptying and families returned home, a coordinated plan to destabilize the country was already underway. This was not a spontaneous act. It was a structured, multi-layered operation designed to unfold in stages. The first and most critical step was the targeted assassination of Ibrahim Traoré, the country's transitional head of state. Security officials made one point unmistakably clear. The objective was not to seize power through a traditional coup. There were no plans for televised announcements, no immediate replacement government, and no political roadmap following the attack. The objective was singular and final: eliminate the president. Investigators revealed that 2 assassination scenarios were prepared. The first involved a direct close-range shooting carried out by someone operating within Traoré's immediate proximity, someone familiar enough to bypass suspicion and security routines. The second option was more indirect but equally lethal, an action aimed at undermining the stability and security of his private residence, creating an opportunity for fatal exposure. Once that first act was completed, the plan was designed to escalate rapidly. Authorities explained that the next phase involved the neutralization of a strategic drone base, a move intended to blind surveillance and limit the government's ability to respond quickly. That action would then be followed by ground-level military intervention, supported by external forces, transforming a single killing into nationwide instability within hours. This sequencing matters. It reveals intent. The planners understood that removing Traoré alone was not enough. The country's defensive capacity had to be weakened immediately afterward, before public order or loyal units could reorganize. Speed, confusion, and shock were central to the strategy. What prevented this chain reaction was not luck, it was intelligence. Burkina Faso's security services confirmed that communications linked to the network were intercepted, allowing authorities to map relationships, identify intermediaries, and trace the flow of money. Several individuals, both military and civilian, were placed under surveillance before arrests began. In some cases, suspects were apprehended while funds were actively being distributed. Officials emphasized that many civilians involved were not ideological actors. Some were recruited as messengers, drivers, or local mobilizers used to create the appearance of popular support once violence erupted. This tactic, investigators noted, was designed to make the aftermath look organic, as though the population itself had turned against its leader. The financial trail raised further alarm. Security authorities disclosed that a significant portion of the funding originated outside Burkina Faso, with allegations pointing toward channels linked to Ivory Coast. One reported operation alone was said to involve tens of millions in regional currency, with approximately $125,000 USD traced directly to operational payments on the ground. As arrests continued, officials announced that confession videos from key actors would be released to the media, signaling confidence in the investigation and a desire to confront public speculation with evidence. Most importantly, the government issued a direct reassurance the situation was under control. The assassination had been prevented, and the country had not crossed the point of no return. But beneath that reassurance lay a sobering reality. This was not an isolated incident. It was the third known attempt on Traoré's life in 2 years. And that fact alone transformed the event from a security scare into a warning one about how dangerous change can be when it threatens entrenched systems. The emotional and political climax of this story did not come with gunfire or explosions. It came with a calm voice delivered behind a podium carrying words that froze an entire nation. When the Minister of Security of Burkina Faso addressed the public, his tone was steady, almost restrained. But the substance of his message was anything but ordinary. This was not a routine security update. This was a declaration that the state itself had narrowly escaped collapse. He began by honoring the defense and security forces, intelligence officers, and civilian volunteers who had worked day and night to protect the country. This opening was deliberate. Before naming threats or suspects, the government chose to emphasize sacrifice, resilience, and patriotism, signaling that what had just happened was a national trial, not merely a political incident. Then came the confirmation that changed everything. At 11:00 p.m. on January 3, 2026, authorities said an operation to destabilize the country had entered its final phase. The first target was clear: Ibrahim Traoré, the transitional head of state. The plan called for his neutralization either through a direct close-range assault or through an attack compromising the security of his personal residence. There was no ambiguity in the language, no euphemisms, no attempt to soften the reality. This was an assassination plan confirmed, documented, and already in motion. As the briefing continued, the room grew heavier. The minister explained that the plot extended far beyond one trigger pull. It was a networked operation involving military actors tasked with recruiting other soldiers, civilians mobilized to simulate popular support, and coordinators assigned to manage logistics and funding. Then came the most explosive revelation. Due to the sensitivity of the investigation, the government announced it would publicly name only one central figure at this stage. That name carried weight across the Sahel: Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Once the sitting president, Damiba was now living in exile in Togo, just across the border. According to authorities, his role was not symbolic. He was accused of conceiving the plan, mobilizing funds, and recruiting both civilian and military intermediaries to execute the operation. For many citizens, this revelation was deeply unsettling. The threat was not distant. It was not abstract. It came from someone who once held the same office, walked the same corridors, and commanded the same institutions. Public reaction was immediate and emotional. Across Ouagadougou and other cities, citizens expressed shock, anger, and fear, but also defiance. Community patrols intensified. Informal neighborhood watches formed overnight. People began sharing information, watching unfamiliar faces, and openly declaring loyalty to the state. The government described this as a spontaneous act of national solidarity. At the same time, officials issued a sobering warning. During the investigation, numerous ordinary civilians had been questioned not because they were conspirators, but because they had been used unknowingly. Some had delivered messages, others had transported money. A few had simply connected people without understanding the larger purpose. This, the minister stressed, was why vigilance mattered. Destabilization does not always arrive wearing a uniform. Internationally, reactions were muted. No urgent condemnations. No emergency summits. That silence did not go unnoticed by the Burkinabe public, who were left to process the gravity of the moment largely on their own. The climax of this story, then, was not just the exposure of a failed assassination. It was the realization that change had crossed a line and that the forces resisting it were willing to erase a life to preserve a system. The assassination attempt may have failed, but its consequences spread quietly into the lives of ordinary people across Burkina Faso. In the days that followed, the security briefing arrests continued. Networks were dismantled piece by piece. Phones were seized, financial records reviewed, and movements retraced. Yet, what became increasingly clear was this: not everyone caught in the net understood what they were part of. Authorities acknowledged that a significant number of civilians questioned during the investigation were not ideological opponents of the government. They were drivers asked to deliver envelopes, neighbors asked to pass messages, small traders told to hold money briefly, people pulled into a web they did not see executing minor tasks that on their own seemed harmless. This revelation changed the tone of the national conversation. The government's message shifted from celebration to caution. Officials urged citizens to exercise discernment in their daily activities. Not paranoia, but awareness. Not fear, but judgment. The warning was clear. Destabilization often moves through ordinary routines, not dramatic confrontations. For many families, the experience was sobering. A simple phone call, a familiar face asking for a favor, a small payment framed as routine assistance. These were the entry points. The crisis exposed how fragile the line can be between normal life and political violence when trust is exploited. Politically, the impact was even deeper. The attempted assassination reinforced a truth that many in Burkina Faso already felt but rarely articulated openly: reform creates enemies faster than speeches create allies. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, long-standing systems were being challenged, systems built on delay favoritism and quiet extraction of wealth. Roads were being built, hospitals expanded, state authority reasserted, opportunities redirected toward widows, orphans, and young workers. To those benefiting from the old order, this was not reform, it was disruption. Within bureaucracies, resistance hardened. In informal networks, resentment grew. For individuals accustomed to power without accountability, the president himself became the obstacle. And when removing the obstacle peacefully seemed impossible, violence became the chosen tool. The state responded by tightening security not only around institutions but around trust itself. Citizen vigilance programs were reinforced. Reporting mechanisms expanded. Communities were encouraged to protect not just a leader, but a direction. At the same time, officials emphasized unity. There were no calls for revenge, no ethnic framing, no sweeping accusations against entire groups. Instead, the government framed the crisis as a test of national cohesion, one that could either fracture society or strengthen it. That framing mattered. In neighborhoods across Ouagadougou, people spoke openly about fear, but also about pride. Pride that the plot had failed. Pride that intelligence services had acted in time. Pride that ordinary citizens, once informed, chose to protect rather than panic. Still, the psychological impact lingered. When a leader survives multiple assassination attempts, the message received by the public is not just that danger exists, but that danger has become normalized. And that realization forces a nation to confront difficult questions about how much change it can sustain and how high the cost of that change might be. The assassination attempt did not merely threaten one life. It forced Burkina Faso to reckon with what transformation truly demands and who is willing to pay its price. From Washington, Brussels, and major Western capitals, the response to the attempted assassination in Burkina Faso was striking, not for what was said, but for what was not. There were no urgent press conferences, no emergency debates, no strong coordinated condemnations dominating global headlines. For many observers in Africa, that silence spoke volumes. In the United States, where political violence is often framed as a global concern when it aligns with strategic interests, the lack of sustained coverage raised uncomfortable questions. If an elected or transitional leader in a Western-aligned state had narrowly escaped a third assassination attempt in 2 years, would the reaction have been the same? History suggests otherwise. American audiences, especially those who remember the Cold War, have seen this pattern before. Leaders in the Global South who attempt to restructure power, redirect resources, or loosen dependency often find themselves isolated internationally long before they are physically threatened. When pressure fails, destabilization follows. And when destabilization fails, elimination becomes an option. The case of Ibrahim Traoré fits uncomfortably into that historical framework. His government's push for sovereignty, domestic control of resources, and new security partnerships challenges long-standing regional arrangements. That alone makes him controversial in global policy circles, even if those controversies are rarely discussed openly. From a U.S. strategic perspective, the Sahel has increasingly been framed through the lens of counterterrorism and great power competition. Stability is often defined narrowly: cooperation, predictability, and alignment. When a leader redefines stability as independence, friction becomes inevitable. Yet the moral contradiction is hard to ignore. American political culture celebrates reformers, figures who drain swamps, challenge entrenched interests, and promise renewal. But when similar narratives emerge outside familiar borders, they are often treated with suspicion or silence. The attempted assassination of a reform-oriented African leader becomes a footnote rather than a warning. International organizations echoed this restraint. Statements emphasized monitoring the situation and respecting sovereignty, but avoided deeper engagement with the implications. No serious inquiry into cross-border financing, no public discussion of accountability, just cautious language designed not to disrupt diplomatic equilibrium. Across the global South, however, the reaction was different. In parts of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, the incident was viewed as another example of how reformers are punished, not rewarded, for attempting structural change. The lesson drawn was not subtle: political independence carries real risks, and international protection is far from guaranteed. For American viewers, this moment invites reflection. What does global leadership truly mean if assassination attempts against reformers pass quietly? Is stability defined by peace or by predictability? And at what point does silence become complicity? The attempted killing in Burkina Faso was not just a local security event. It was a mirror held up to the international system, revealing who receives protection, who receives attention, and who is left to survive on their own. What happened in Burkina Faso was not just a failed assassination. It was a warning, quiet, precise, and deeply unsettling. When a nation reaches a point where reform repeatedly triggers bullets instead of debate, something far bigger than politics is at stake. The attempted killing of Ibrahim Traoré revealed how fragile transformation can be when it threatens long-protected systems. It showed how quickly resistance hardens when privileges are challenged, and how easily violence becomes the language of last resort. For many Burkinabe citizens, the message was sobering, but clear change is no longer theoretical. It has consequences, and those consequences do not fall on leaders alone. They ripple through neighborhoods, families, and daily life, forcing ordinary people to choose between silence and vigilance, fear and responsibility. Yet there is another side to this story. Despite the danger, the state did not collapse. The streets did not descend into chaos. Institutions held, citizens mobilized, not with weapons, but with awareness. In a region often portrayed as perpetually unstable, that resilience matters. It challenges assumptions. It complicates easy narratives. The broader implication reaches far beyond one country. Across Africa and much of the global South, leaders attempting structural change face the same invisible test. How much reform is tolerated before it becomes too much? History suggests that when reform crosses an unwritten line, the response is rarely policy disagreement. It is disruption, then destabilization, then sometimes elimination. For American viewers, especially those who have lived through decades of global political shifts, this moment invites deeper reflection. Democracy, sovereignty, and reform are celebrated ideals, but in practice, they are unevenly protected. Some leaders are shielded by global outrage. Others are left to survive quietly, hoping their intelligence services move faster than their enemies. And that leads to the most important question of all: how many warnings does the world ignore before tragedy becomes inevitable? The attempt on Traoré's life failed this time, but history tells us that persistence often outlasts protection. Whether this moment becomes a turning point or just another chapter in a familiar story depends not only on Burkina Faso, but on how the world chooses to respond. If you believe these stories deserve more than silence, please share this video. If you think truth matters more than headlines, consider subscribing. And tell us in the comments, do you believe leaders like this can survive long enough to finish the work they start? Because in today's Africa, news survival itself has become part of the struggle, and the outcome is never guaranteed.